Welcome to this explainer. Right now, I'd bet good money you have some of this stuff sitting in a cardboard box in your recycling bin. I'm talking, of course, about bubble wrap. But we're not just looking at a piece of plastic today. We're unpacking, pun absolutely intended, a totally wild narrative of accidental innovation. How did an everyday object born from a completely accidental, actually failed origin story turn into a multi-billion-dollar global titan? And maybe more importantly, how did it create one of the most urgent environmental paradoxes of modern e-commerce? Let's dive right in. Okay, so I want you to take a wild guess. Transport yourself back to 1957, Hawthorne, New Jersey. Two engineers, Alfred Fielding and Mark Chavons, are just tinkering away in a garage. They take two plastic shower curtains, run them through a heat sealing machine, and trap these little pockets of air between them. So what exactly were they trying to make? Honestly, I can almost guarantee you won't guess it, unless, you happen to be a historian of super bizarre interior design.
The truth is honestly kind of absurd. They were trying to invent avant-garde 3D wallpaper for the Beat generation. Yeah, you heard that right, wallpaper. They genuinely thought the rebellious post-war youth of the 1950s would go crazy for textured, space-age plastic walls that also happened to offer thermal insulation. But, well, the concept failed completely. It didn't fit design trends, it didn't even have a paper backing so you couldn't actually get it to stick to the walls, and it was just way too expensive. So they had to pivot.
So attempt number 2. It wasn't packaging either. They pitched it as greenhouse insulation. And hey, the logic kind of tracks. The clear plastic lets the light in, and those little air bubbles provide a thermal barrier. But failed again. The plastic degraded incredibly fast under the sun's UV rays, and the actual insulation value? It just wasn't high enough to compete with your standard glass or fiberglass. So that's two massive commercial failures right back to back.
But despite those two massive flops, Fielding and Chavons actually doubled down. In 1960, they formally founded the Sealed Air Corporation. They went public, and they raised $85,000. But the real inflection point, the moment everything changed, actually happened a year before that. In October 1959, that's when IBM announced their 1401 mainframe computer. And that single announcement was the spark that literally ignited an entire industry.
To really understand why this pivot worked, you've got to grasp the sheer logistical nightmare IBM was dealing with. The 1401 was this revolutionary machine, right? Designed to democratize business computing. But it cost $150,000. Today, that's roughly $1.5 million. It was incredibly fragile, completely packed with sensitive electronics, and IBM had to somehow ship these things safely across the country's bumpy new highway system. And the standard protective packaging back in the 60s, we're talking crumpled up newspaper, dusty sawdust, wood shavings, literally horsehair. Obviously, totally inadequate for a highly sensitive million-dollar computer.
Enter Frederick W. Bowers. He's a marketer at Sealed Air, and he reads about this new IBM 1401. He has a massive light bulb moment and pitches their failed plastic wallpaper to IBM's engineers as the ultimate cushioning solution. And IBM tests it. They love it. They adopt it completely. They eventually shipped 12,000 units of that 1401 mainframe wrapped in the stuff. That single massive customer basically validated bubble wrap overnight. Other companies saw what IBM was doing, followed suit, and just like that, the protective packaging industry was officially born.
So why does it actually work so perfectly? Well, it comes down to LDPE, or low-density polyethylene. Basically, through an extrusion and lamination process, they take heated polymer films, pull them over rollers that have these tiny little hemispherical cavities, vacuum form them into bubbles, and then seal them with a second flat layer of film. Now, LDPE is uniquely flexible, it's transparent, and it's chemically resistant. That makes it the absolute perfect vessel to permanently trap air. The physics happening here are pretty simple, but honestly incredibly elegant. When a package drops, those air bubbles compress. It instantly converts the kinetic energy of the fall into potential energy stored right in that compressed air. That cellular structure distributes the impact force across multiple bubbles. It dampens the vibrations that would normally rattle sensitive electronics, and it conforms perfectly to totally irregular shapes. It's like you're effectively suspending a heavy object in a custom protective matrix of air.
But look, there is another reason this material completely conquered the world, and it has absolutely nothing to do with shipping logistics. It's the pop. We all know it. Research published in the 1990s by psychology professor Kathleen M. Dillon actually showed that popping bubble wrap literally reduces human stress. She compared it to those little nervous motions we do, like finger tapping, that help release muscle tension. So it turns out, wanting to pop it is a deeply ingrained, totally universal human response.
And we know exactly how deeply people love that pop, because of a huge controversy back in 2015. So Sealed Air introduced iBubble Wrap.
Logistically, it was brilliant. The bubbles were connected in columns, so it shipped completely flat, and you just inflated it on site. But there was a catch. When you squeeze one bubble, the air just squishes over to the next one. No pop. Well, the public backlash was immediate and fierce. Total internet outrage. People were furious. Sealed Air literally had to issue public statements clarifying they would still make the classic popping version. It just goes to show how this industrial material had essentially become a beloved cultural icon.
But we need to talk about the dark side of this cultural icon. Check out this terrifying statistic. Out of all the plastic waste ever generated globally, only an estimated 9% has ever been recycled. 9%. The rest just ends up sitting in landfills, getting burned in incinerators, or leaking out into our natural environments. And this right here is where our accidental 1950s invention turns into an urgent modern crisis.
If you look at the trajectory of e-commerce plastic packaging waste, it is staggering. We went from 2.2 billion pounds in 2019 straight up to 3.88 billion pounds in 2022. And by 2027, projections are pointing to an alarming 6.8 billion pounds globally. Now here's the kicker. Protective packaging, so your bubble wraps, your air pillows, that accounts for over 35% of this entire waste footprint.
The fundamental issue boils down to the LDPE life cycle. It is an absolute genius material for protecting a package for, say, 3 days in transit. But it is a complete disaster for the next 1,000 years. It's primarily designed for single use. If you try to do the right thing and throw it in your curbside recycling, that flexible film actually clogs up municipal recycling equipment. In a landfill, it takes anywhere from 100 to 1,000 years to degrade. And when it finally does break down out in the wild, it just shatters into harmful microplastics that infiltrate our water systems and food chains. Which brings us to this ultimate modern paradox. The global protective packaging market is a massive $37.8 billion industry. Think about this. A roll of traditional bubble wrap is roughly 98% air. Sounds highly efficient, right? But that remaining 2% of petroleum-based plastic represents a permanent, compounding waste problem that our global ecosystems simply cannot absorb anymore.
Now, governments around the world are definitely not ignoring this. The regulatory pressure is mounting, and it's mounting fast. The European Union has mandated a 65% recycling rate for packaging by 2025. Over in the UK, they've implemented a strict tax on any plastic packaging that has less than 30% recycled content. California's SB 54 requires all packaging to be 100% recyclable or compostable by 2032. Plus, we're seeing this massive global push for extended producer responsibility, or EPR. That basically means manufacturers themselves have to start footing the bill for the end-of-life cleanup of their products.
So right against this backdrop of intense environmental pressure, we saw a massive corporate shakeup. In April 2026, the private investment firm Clayton, Dubilier & Rice finalized a $10.3 billion buyout of Sealed Air, essentially taking the company private. And the big question hanging over the entire industry right now is this: will private ownership, suddenly free from the constant pressure of quarterly public earnings reports, actually accelerate the investment needed for a green transformation? Or will the high debt levels usually associated with these buyouts lead to aggressive cost-cutting that just totally hinders sustainable innovation? Regardless of the buyout, the industry knows it has to adapt. So what are the actual viable alternatives out there? Well, traditional LDPE bubble wrap gives you high protection for a very low cost, but obviously poor sustainability. Then we have emerging biomaterials, like mushroom packaging. That offers high protection and excellent sustainability. It's actually home compostable. But right now, the cost is a major hurdle. It's very expensive. Then there's paper cushioning. Highly sustainable, low cost, but it really only offers medium protection. And for something like precision electronics, medium protection just isn't always going to cut it.
So the innovation race is absolutely on to bridge these gaps. Manufacturers are scrambling to save their market share in a new circular economy. We're seeing the rollout of flexible films with over 90% recycled content. There is heavy R&D pouring into polylactic acid, or PLA, and other bio-based films derived from things like cornstarch or seaweed. For heavy-duty business-to-business shipping, they're developing inflatable cushions meant to be reused 50 times or more. And honestly, perhaps most critically, fulfillment centers are now using AI and robotics to automatically right-size packaging. That ensures a box uses the absolute bare minimum amount of protective material necessary. From a failed avant-garde wallpaper to the absolute backbone of the global e-commerce explosion, bubble wrap is such an incredible testament to the power of the pivot. I mean, it perfectly solved a massive problem back in the 1960s. But today, the problem isn't getting a computer safely across the country. The problem is what happens to all that packaging after it arrives. And that leaves us with a provocative thought to end on today. As consumers driving this massive e-commerce boom, we demand perfect, undamaged deliveries on our doorsteps in 2 days or less. But is that pristine, unboxing convenience today truly worth the permanent environmental cost we are pushing onto tomorrow?